Hi, and welcome to Coffee with the Consultant. Today we have Isaac Fisher here to talk everything graduate recruitment. Isaac is an Oliver Wyman incoming graduate starting in 2021, and we're really excited to have you here. So, Isaac, can you talk a little bit about your journey to consulting and who you are?
Sure. Well, thanks very much for having me. I'm sort of happy to sort of share some of my experiences, and hopefully they're very insightful for everyone that hopefully tunes in. But yeah, so my name is Isaac Fisher, and I'm a student at QUT in my final semester, doing a Bachelor of Laws and a Bachelor of Business, majoring in finance. So I had a pretty traditional sort of career to consulting once I got to uni, but I suppose a little bit untraditional was my sort of journey to uni. So I originally sort of was a cricket player. I sort of was trying to become a professional cricket player sort of through the end of high school, and then moved to Brisbane to play sort of Queensland under 17s and under 19s cricket, made like an Australian team as well. So that was really cool. But then I started at uni, and I sort of fell in love with the people there. And I just thought it was really great to sort of meet other like-minded people that also had sort of ambitious sort of career views similar to me. So ultimately that saw me go through uni, joining the case competition team with yourself. I worked at a publicly listed real estate company. That was my sort of job while I was at uni. Applied at sort of I ended up doing two law firm clerkships, both in the mergers and acquisitions team there. And then I dabbled in two consulting internships as well, which ultimately saw me really enjoy the consulting and really enjoy, I suppose, what they had to offer as opposed to some of the other careers that I looked for, especially starting out. I think consulting sort of gives you a broad range of skills, and it's sort of the typical things that you hear about it, that it's sort of diverse and a good way to sort of broaden your knowledge of corporate Australia.
Yeah, awesome. And so what was your the best experience you had at uni, do you think, or what set you up best for consulting?
I think the best thing, the definite highlight for me was going to Budapest in my first case competition. I just thought to meet, so not only when you join uni, you meet people that are sort of like-minded and have similar interests, to see that on such a global scale with, 16 teams, I think, from all around the world, and talking to those individuals who are trying to become consultants or have become consultants or are working in law or working in private equity or investment banking, those sorts of things, was really, really cool. And then also, obviously, to go to Europe was fantastic too. So I think that was probably the best experience for me.
Yeah, for sure. It's a great opportunity. So maybe let's pivot slightly to how you landed your grad role. So can you talk a bit about the application process, maybe from start to finish, and then we can knuckle into some of the things that you thought were challenging or that you thought, or bits of advice you might have?
Yeah, sure. So I suppose like most roles, it starts off with sort of an application. And that really involves just submitting your academic transcript, a cover letter, and your resume. But I suppose sort of the key difference in consulting versus maybe other industries is the sort of scrutiny that your CV goes under, not only from terms of, just being very polished and having no spelling mistakes, those sorts of things. From my understanding, they're basically marked against a rubric that has sort of like your academic grades, the quality of the internships or work experience that you have, and then leadership qualities. And then there might be, some firms have sort of another X factor box. So if you did something interesting, like you started a charity or you went to the Olympics or something like that. We did international sailing, something like that. Yeah, I've heard that was one of the X factor qualities. But really, you've got to be able to demonstrate in your cover letter that you have you've had experiences that relate to consulting. So even just from the phrasing. So I was the treasurer at the QUT Law Society, and instead of just saying, I assisted the QT Law Society with getting sponsorship or those sorts of things. It's more sort of the qualitative and quantitative elements that consultants are looking for. So it was, it was able to increase the revenues by 6%. We saw sponsorship increase as well by 4%, making those numbers up. But those sorts of things, and being able to demonstrate that across your entire CV, from not only your work experience, but right through to sort of the volunteering work that you do as well. That's a pretty key feature that I think is different to a lot of other job applications. And then also, I think one tip that helped me was that you need consultants to proofread your cover letter and your CV, because ultimately they're the ones that read your CV and cover letter. So they often get the sort of the junior consultants to do the screening against the rubric that I sort of mentioned earlier. So the more people that you can have that are already in that industry looking at your CV, I think the better off you'll be. And that was some really good advice that I got. And then, I knew a few consultants, but I didn't know heaps of consultants. So then I went about sort of just messaging people on LinkedIn. So I think that's probably a really key tip that a lot of students don't do, is sort of the networking aspect. It's not necessarily going to actually land you a job. Someone's not going to be able to refer you per se, but they'll be able to maybe proofread your cover letter. They might be able to tell you some of the key values that the firm has that they don't necessarily display on their website, which might sort of show that you're curious about the firm. So those sorts of things. So that's sort of the first step. And then once you get through that, you then go through a series of interviews. So there's sort of between 2 and 3 rounds of interviews for each firm. And they consist of 2 parts. There's the sort of personal experience part, which is common amongst a lot of firms, or a lot of industries or a lot of jobs, talking about sort of, your characteristics, your strengths and weaknesses, all those sorts of things. And then the second part, which is unique to consulting interviews, is around the actual consulting case that you do. So that's sort of maybe a 30 to 40 minute case about some sort of problem that you have to solve, and you work through with the interviewer to ultimately arrive at some decision. And it's sort of business situational cases. So, for instance, I had one that was, we're advising a private equity firm that's looking to enter the dog food market. Isaac, can you tell me how big the dog food market is in Australia? And then what are the key characteristics that you'd look for in a good company if you were to buy it? So then you spend sort of the next 5 minutes going through how big the dog food market is, which at the beginning sounds quite terrifying, but once you sort of do a bit of practice and you get into it, you sort of understand the frameworks and the sort of ways you can go about it. And yeah, that's basically it.
Yeah, awesome. And was there any behavioral interviews that you did as well as the case interviews? And what do you think they were most interested in hearing from you there? Similar to your cover letter, or?
Yeah, so the behavioral interviews were just trying to get to know you. So I had some that were, one of them, the only question I asked was, just tell me something that you've learned in the last sort of 10 weeks and explain to me the concept. And then that stemmed the entire interview until the case. So I sort of spoke about this book that I was reading and some of the key lessons that had. And then that opened up a whole can of worms, and we went on a bunch of different tangents. But they weren't too formulaic. They was very relaxed in how you're going, as opposed to some of the other interviews that I've done in the other industries, which were very much sort of set questions. HR would ask a couple, then a staff member would ask a couple, and they'd sort of bounce back and forth. This was just one-on-one, very conversational, and just getting to know you and why you're motivated to do consulting. And I think really trying to understand whether you know what consulting is the other thing. So it's quite an interesting sector, and it's, some people might say it's quite glamorous, but then I think the nuts and bolts, it's not overly glamorous. You're doing sort of difficult work, it's hard work, and ultimately they want to know that you can do that, and you're not just there for the money or the perceived status or whatever. Yeah.
And so what do you think management consulting is, or how would you describe it to someone who doesn't really know much about it?
Yeah, so I've been playing golf a lot recently, and I've been playing with like random people, and they sort of ask, "Oh, what are you doing next year?" When I say that I'm like about to finish uni, and
Yeah.
I sort of got to explain what it is, and I just say it's sort of business advisory, and then a lot of the time they say, "Don't you have to work in a business to be able to provide business advice?" And I say, "It's a good question, but I suppose there's a number of sort of tools that consultants use in order to arrive at solutions for clients that don't necessarily involve, 15, 20 years of experience." But then you also think about it in your consulting team when you're on a project, there is a partner who does have that sort of deep industry knowledge. They've worked with the competitors, they've worked with this client before maybe. So my role as a junior consultant, I suspect, is more so behind the scenes,
Yeah.
doing the data analysis and those sorts of things.
Yeah, cool. And so maybe pivoting back a little bit to your prep for applications, what do you think, how did you approach your preparation, and what do you think was the most useful things that you did?
Yeah, so I think I probably went a bit overboard. I sort of, I suppose to begin, it is a lot of work. Everyone I've spoken to and anyone who gets a job in consulting has done loads of preparation. So I think I started at the end of one of my internships in early February, maybe February 10 or something like that. And then I got my final sort of offer on the 30th of March. So it's sort of like a whole 1.5 months of regularly reviewing sort of online material. I think one key thing is practicing math. So I did that heaps. So you've got to be able to do really quick mathematics in your head, which I wasn't great at to begin with, but I managed to download an app, and I did 30 minutes every morning. I would go basically you're doing things like what's 1,000 times 65,000. And like to get the right zeros is quite difficult, especially under the pressure, because that's sort of how you solve that question about how big is the dog food market in Australia. Because you go, it's all based on assumptions. They don't expect you to arrive at the right answer, but you go sort of like, there's 23 million people in Australia. I assume that, or out of the people that I know, maybe 1 in 4 households has a dog. So there's 3 households, 3 people in each household, for instance. So there's like 7 million roughly households in Australia. A quarter of them have a dog, and then you do that and you do the math for that. So that's the sort of level of mathematics you need to do, and quite quickly. And then I did a bunch of case interviews practice. So that's probably the key one. So you need to be able to find someone else who is going through the same thing as you and be able to do case interviews with them. So one of you takes the role of the interviewer, the other takes the role of the interviewee, and you just go through, and there's heaps of online resources. I think like, I was just looking at my list of places that had them before, and there's sort of like McKinsey, Bain, BCG, Oliver Wyman, LEK, Strategy and Port Jackson Partners. They all have practice interviews. So I did every single one, and you can do some by yourself, or you can get a friend to help you out with it. It's probably best to get a friend, because then you get an understanding of how to ask them questions in order to get information from them, which is a really big part of it. And then obviously a lot of time was spent sort of refining my CV and writing my applications for each of the firms, and trying to meet someone from the firm who could help me out and help look over my cover letter, or could provide some insight about sort of what type of work they do. I think that's another key one. Yeah. So I suppose, for example, Oliver Wyman has a really big financial services practice. So just knowing that and being able to talk about that, not only in the interview, but also in your cover letter, I think is really valuable. And all the firms have their own sort of niches that they're really good at.
Yeah, for sure. That's interesting. And so you'd spent a lot of time preparing, and it's obviously worked out for you, which is great. So is there anything you wish you had known before starting the interviews or starting the application process?
I think they're not trying to trick you. So it's like the questions that they ask are more likely than not, they're just going to be interested in relation to both asking questions about you. So, like, oh, what's this on your CV about you? Or why did you get a 4 in this subject? Or why did you get a 5 in this subject? Or why did you fail this subject?
Yeah.
they're not like, it's not a mean question. It's more so just trying to understand why. It might be because you were doing 5 subjects that semester. It might be because you had some personal difficulties, those sorts of things.
Mm.
They're not trying to catch you out. They're just genuinely curious people that are curious about your career and what brings you to the interview. I suppose another one is you've got to be conscious that a lot of it is sort of luck driven. Unfortunately,
Mm.
don't be too disheartened if you miss out, because I know a lot of people who had really good CVs and really good grades who sort of missed out. And by the time you boil it down, there's only so many spots, and it's such small things. Like I had someone tell me that, you know, when they're marking CVs, you know, if it's 11 p.m., they're going to be more harsh because they're annoyed that they're marking at 11 p.m. than if it was 7 p.m.
For sure.
So those are things you can't control. So if you happen to miss out, don't be too disheartened, because there's always other opportunities. So I think those are probably the 2 things I wish I knew.
Yeah, no, those are good tips as well, honestly. So, what do you think you're most excited for, or what do you think will be the most challenging aspect of your graduate program? Any insight into that so far? I guess you haven't started yet, but
Oh yeah, I haven't started yet, but I'm excited to. I'm moving down to Sydney, so the office is in Sydney. So I think that'll be pretty exciting, getting used to all that, sort of making friends, meeting people in the office. I'm really excited to just work with some really intelligent, like-minded people. I think that was one really exciting thing that I found about uni, and another exciting thing I found about the case competition, as well as the internships. You just keep meeting people that have similar interests and obviously quite bright and gifted. So to meet those people again, and you know, on such a wealth where they're willing to share their experiences to me as someone coming in at the beginning, I think that's what I'm looking forward to. Some of the challenging things, I think, is just the nature of the work and having to sort of learn on the job. I think I've got a week or 2 in Singapore, if that goes ahead with the current sort of COVID restrictions, but that's like training, and then straight into a project. So the first, I think, 6 months will be a really steep learning curve, but I really look forward to it. So it should be fun.
Yeah, that's exciting. And you probably don't have a huge amount of control in what projects you get staffed on, maybe even in the first few years, but is there any particular areas that you're interested in, or that you'd like, or sectors that you'd like to have a go at?
Yeah, I'm fairly sector agnostic in the sense that I've worked in sort of real estate. I've done some public sector stuff. I did some law transactions, and I really like the sort of transactional law work that I did. So I did some sort of private equity work, and I'm interested to do that as well. So I know Oliver Wyman has a sort of emerging private equity corporate due diligence practice. So that's sort of analyzing companies in a really short period of time. So I think that's really exciting. I look forward to that. And then also just sort of general strategy. I think you can learn so much from it. And that's sort of the key takeaway that I'm looking at in my first couple of years, is just to learn as much as I can.
Yeah, that's awesome. And so maybe pivoting back slightly to your choice to pursue management consulting. So obviously you've had a really broad range of experiences. Is there a particular point when you realized that this is what you wanted to do, or I know you've kind of spoken about it throughout, but is there a particular reason that management consulting is so interesting to you, maybe as opposed to the other experiences that you've had?
Yeah, so I suppose when I was sort of trying to figure out what I really wanted to do, one piece of advice that I got was it's really hard to tell what you'd like to do, but it's really easy to rule out things that you've already done.
Sure.
So I tried to get as much experience as I could. And, you know, whether that's in sort of law or in sort of transactional work or in consulting or a certain type of consulting, I was able to figure out that what I was interested in was consulting. And by consulting was just sort of the interactions that you get to have with clients, as well as the sort of type of work. It was very analytical. It was coming up with recommendations that were implementable for senior executives. And that was what really excited me. And I suppose being able to sort of sit there and explain to someone who's, you know, 20 years older than me, why I think that, you know, they should deploy capital in this way, or why they should move their sort of ideas this way, to me, that was really appealing. And I suppose ultimately the other thing is the learning opportunities are just sort of endless. And for me, I always love learning, and I love the sort of process of going through trying to learn something very quickly. So that was really appealing to me.
Yeah, awesome. That's really interesting. And I think a range of good reasons, very good reasons. So we might wrap up soon, but what we're doing here with Coffee with a Consultant is at the end of all of the interviews, we're going to ask the person we have on for a tip of the week or a recommendation they may have. So this can be anything you want it to be.
Sure.
It be a book maybe that you read, maybe the one you talked about in your interview,
Yeah.
anything like that, something that you think everyone should know.
Yeah. Okay. So there's probably two things. One is, there's two. One of them is make sure you stay abreast of news. Yeah. So because, consultants are very much business savvy people that are very interested in what's going on around the world in business and otherwise. So I would always read the AFR, but I suppose what I would, everyone sort of, like a lot of people know about that, but something that I found very useful was this podcast called The Squiz. It's like SQUIZ, Squiz podcast. And it's sort of 8-minute news every morning at sort of 5, they release it. So if you wake up, I listen to it when I'm getting ready, and it sort of just gives you maybe 4 news story headlines and a little bit of detail about them. And then they've also got a more in-depth version. So they might do maybe like a 20-minute episode on what's happening in the US with the politics, what's the current sort of Australian government stance on the COVID response, and then a whole range of other things. So that was really useful, and I still listen to it now, and I think that's really useful. But then, that book, I've actually got in my couple of books here. This is the one. It's called The Future of Capitalism by Paul Collier. It's pretty short. Yeah. It's maybe 200 pages. He's a economics professor at Oxford, and I think he also has a number of sort of board positions at sort of like UN style organizations. But he just talks about how sort of capitalism has derailed, and sort of there's been a rebellion similar to, it's sort of a commonly repeated historic rebellion that happens with sort of the working class. And you're seeing that again with sort of the rise of Trump and the rise of nationalism and those sorts of things. So he talks about sort of how he, in really pragmatic ways, can sort of change the way in which we're going. And, one solution is to sort of tax companies that benefit too much from globalization, where a lot of places have been displaced from globalization. And an easy example, sort of the Holden has moved out of Australia. It's non-existent anymore, the car company. And the reason being is because cars are able to be imported from international companies due to this great globalization. So whilst that's very positive, it also has these negative effects. And he talks about ways to sort of combat that. So those are sort of my 2 recommendations, and they sort of helped me out a bit.
Yeah, those are great recommendations. I also listened to the Squiz, and I would
good.
I would absolutely recommend it as well. Well, thank you so much, Isaac. This has been really great, and I'm sure all of our members and the broader QTCS community is really going to enjoy listening to you. So best of luck for starting your graduate program, and I think it's very clear that you're going to excel and do an absolutely incredible job.
Thanks. Yeah, no, it was really good. I hope everyone can find something useful out of it. And if anyone has any questions, I'm more than happy to answer. If you just, I'm sure you can pass on my details if someone wants.
Yeah, absolutely. Perhaps messaging on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Isaac.
No worries. Thank you very much.